This is the story of Neshan Krikorian, an overlooked survivor of the Titanic who escaped ethnic persecution in the Ottoman Empire, crossed the Atlantic to escape death, survived the sinking of the so-called unsinkable ship, and then rebuilt his life in Canada after enduring trauma no young man should ever endure. Our story begins in the village of Kegi, then in Russian-ruled Armenia, but now in Turkey. In 1886, Ottoman authorities carried out a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing against Armenians in the region. Men, women and children were executed, and entire villages were burned to the ground. Young Neshan Krikorian and his family were forced to flee their home, seeking safety elsewhere in Turkey. By 1896, enough time had passed for the threat of violence to subside, and Neshan's father made plans to reunite with the family. He left to work in the gold mines of Johannesburg, South Africa, while his wife and 5 children remained back in Turkey. But this proved to be a fatal separation. In 1909, a fire swept through their home and killed them all. At age 23, Neshan Krikorian was now alone and desperate to reunite with his 2 brothers who had emigrated to Canada. According to U.S. Census records, he arrived in Canada in 1911 and worked as a rug weaver and chair factory worker in Hamilton, Ontario. After 2 years saving money, he bought a third-class ticket on the Titanic for £7, 4 shillings and 7 pence and joined the ship in Cherbourg, France. He boarded the Titanic on April 10, 1911. And according to several court records, he traveled under the name John C. Riley. Some sources state that he probably used this alias to avoid detection by Ottoman spies who may have been searching for him. Overcrowding in the steerage was extreme, and Krikorian felt trapped. One of his fellow Armenian passengers later recalled the cramped conditions. "I looked around me and saw nothing but dark faces, dark eyes everywhere. All were jammed together like a barrel of fish. The men cursed and grumbled, babies cried, mothers sang to them and consoled them. I could not find a place to sit down. I could not even stand up straight. We were so close to each other, we had to rub shoulders." On the evening of April 14th, passengers in steerage heard a tremendous crash, followed by violent tremors. However, they were kept in the dark about what had occurred until the next morning. On the morning of the 15th, passengers in steerage began to realize that the ship was in serious trouble. They knew instinctively that the ship was sinking, but were shocked when Captain Smith announced over the intercom that everything would be fine. Passengers rushed to the rails to see the lifeboats lowered into the sea. Some lifeboats were full, and descending passengers had no choice but to climb onto the partially filled boats, pushing and shoving to get in. Other lifeboats were almost empty, and people desperate to save themselves jumped into the few open spots. Lifeboat 10 was about to be lowered when a guard stationed on the deck yelled that women and children must board first. Fellow passengers held Krikorian back, but he wanted off the ship desperately. Seeing that Lifeboat 10 was about to depart, he pushed past the crowd, smashed a padlock chain, and scrambled toward the deck. As he ran across the tilting deck, he saw an open space on Lifeboat 10. Leaping into the last available space, he managed to grab a rope ladder and swing himself over the side as the boat departed the ship. Some witnesses said he was dressed as a woman, and others claimed he had disguised himself in ladies' clothing. But his own testimony cleared up the mystery. He was merely wearing loose-fitting Armenian clothing. Once he was on the boat, he helped lower another lifeboat. Then he looked back at the Titanic, which now appeared only as a faint glow in the distance. By dawn, he and the other occupants of Lifeboat 10 were adrift on the frigid Atlantic. The occupants of Lifeboat 10 drifted all night in darkness and cold, with men sheltering women and children as best they could. They were eventually spotted by the captain of the nearby ship. The captain of the nearby ship. The captain of the nearby ship. When Carpathia approached, the lifeboat occupants began shouting and waving their arms frantically. The captain of Carpathia ordered his crew to lower lifebuoys and pull survivors from the lifeboat into the water. The survivors, wrapped in blankets, were then pulled on board Carpathia. As a survivor of one of the last lifeboats to be retrieved, Krikorian was one of the final Titanic survivors brought aboard. Altogether, 504 survivors were rescued by Carpathia. Of those who boarded Lifeboat 10, only 29 survived. Rescuers placed the survivors of the Titanic aboard the ship for medical treatment. Krikorian, however, was taken off immediately and sent to a waiting motorcar, driven by a man in a black suit who whisked him away to a private hospital. A doctor diagnosed him with exposure and pneumonia, and he spent several weeks recovering in both New York and Canada. After the rescue, there were conflicting reports in the press as to whether first, second, and third-class passengers had been treated equally. First and second-class survivors told reporters that they had shared food, blankets, and lifeboats with third-class passengers during the ordeal. However, many third-class survivors, including Krikorian, disputed these claims, stating that the higher-class passengers had not shared supplies, had tried to prevent them from entering the lifeboats, and had refused to share life jackets. Moreover, third-class survivors alleged that first- and second-class passengers who refused to follow the rules and stay in their cabins were largely unharmed. Meanwhile, those who had attempted to leave steerage were penalized. Upon his recovery, Krikorian set about rebuilding his life in Canada. In 1918, he moved to the nearby city of St. Catharines, where he worked for years on the GM automobile assembly line. He also helped establish the first Armenian church in St. Catharines. He married a childhood friend, Pasape Vartanian, and they raised 2 daughters. For the rest of his life, Krikorian shunned the water. Whenever he went anywhere near a large body of water, his face betrayed his thoughts. Survivors of the Titanic said they never wanted to hear or speak about the disaster again. Many were deeply traumatized by their experience and struggled with physical disabilities as a result of injuries sustained on the Titanic. Others experienced vivid nightmares for years after the disaster. Krikorian was no exception. According to his family, whenever they were asleep, he would awaken screaming, having dreamt that he was back in the freezing waters of the Atlantic Ocean, struggling to stay afloat. Although he never forgot his time on the Titanic, he embraced his new life in Canada and rarely spoke. The world is a wild place full of strange and unusual people. There are some people out there who you may think are crazy, but if you really get to know them, you'll find that they are just living their lives in ways that you can't even comprehend. This is the story of one such person. In November 2012, 36-year-old José Salvador Alvarenga left Costa Azul on the Pacific coast of Mexico, Chiapas, on a routine 2-day shark fishing. He was accompanied by a 22-year-old crewmate, Ezequiel Cordoba. The 25-foot fiberglass boat was well equipped for a day at sea. 70 gallons of fuel, 16 gallons of fresh water, hundreds of fishing hooks, an ice chest with 91 kilograms of ice, a radio, half-charged, and a handheld GPS, not waterproof. Curiously, there was no anchor aboard. Alvarenga later admitted he'd forgotten it. 2 days after departure, a sudden squall forced them to radio a desperate SOS. Cordoba began to panic and vomit in the boat. Then, just off the shore, the engine sputtered and died. Their hopes of rescue were dashed. In those final moments, their radio crackled with a frantic exchange. "We have no GPS, we have no anchor." Before Alvarenga's last words to shore, "Come now, I am really getting in trouble here." Those were the last words heard by anyone. Neither the fishermen nor their craft were ever found by search teams. A missing person report lists the boat as gone after leaving port on November. Almost immediately, a ferocious storm engulfed the little boat. Sheets of rain and towering waves crashed over the sides, dumping hundreds of gallons of seawater. Alvarenga and Cordoba worked in tandem to bail frantically, even huddling inside the ice chest to stay warm as freezing water swirled around. The engine, already sputtering, completely died, and the GPS and radio failed in mid-transmission. A Chiapas official later confirmed the weather was very bad. The boat had almost certainly been blown far off course. With no anchor and no communications, the two men were left adrift and alone at sea. When bigger ships later passed without helping, Alvarenga would remember thinking his desire to live was greater than. On the second day, the wind shifted, and the relentless pounding of waves against the hull drove them from the shelter of the cabin. Huddled together on the deck, the men struggled to keep afloat. The constant assault of wind and waves tossed them like playthings. At times, the waves would lift them entirely out of the boat, suspending them briefly above the churning water before crashing them back into the vessel and knocking them unconscious. For the first few days, the men subsisted on the 16 gallons of fresh water they brought with them, but within a few days, it ran out. Faced with the grim prospect of certain dehydration, they turned to the vast but undrinkable ocean. Trapped without bait or hooks, Alvarenga improvised. He leaned over the railing and caught sharks, tuna, and other fish barehanded, smashing them between cupped hands and flinging them into the boat. Cordoba quickly butchered the catch. They ate it raw or sun-dried. When luck provided a sea turtle or seabirds, they added that to their diet. After 2 months at sea, Alvarenga had become accustomed to capturing and eating birds and turtles. A reporter. Fresh water was even harder to come by. Alvarenga began drinking his own urine when it became scarce, and he and Cordoba even sipped turtle blood from their kills. Both men knew seawater would kill them, so they stubbornly refused even a single cup of ocean water. After about 14 days, a squall finally gave them rain. They had rigged a bucket up on deck, and in one glorious downpour they filled it and drank ravenously, then rationed it over the next few. Over time, they learned to exploit every resource in the endless sea. They saved every floating plastic bottle and piece of debris they could grab, hoping to use them as makeshift containers or flotation devices. One day they snagged a drifting bag and found inside it a half-rotten head of cabbage, some carrots, and a quart of milk. Even the sour milk was a miracle after months of nothing but fish and... Alvarenga later quipped that they ate the soggy carrots with reverence. The strain was brutal. He was starved and dehydrated. An El Salvador doctor found him anemic but surprisingly intact by the time he landed on an atoll. Alvarenga remembered he was totally destroyed and as skinny as a board. Only his skin, bones, and intestine. His ankles were swollen from weeks at the oars, and he could barely walk. Yet despite sun and salt exposure, doctors later noted he had no major physical. "It's incredible," one physician said of his near-normal medical tests. For 438 days, Alvarenga saw nothing but open ocean and sky. He later described living on the edge of sanity, battling intense loneliness and even suicidal thoughts while staring at the moon for night after night. Every hour was a fight to stay hopeful in endless isolation. Cordoba did not survive this test. About 2 months in, he became gravely ill, likely from parasites, after eating raw seabirds and turtles. Cordoba refused all food and wasted away. One agonizing morning, as Cordoba lay dying and begging for water, Alvarenga screamed in panic, "Don't leave me alone! You have to fight for life." http://theguardian.com, https://www.theguardian.com, World 2015, Novi 07, fisherman lost at sea, 436 days, book, extract, percent 2%, 80%, 9 CI, percent 20 AM, percent 20 tired, percent 2C, percent 20 I, percent 21%, 22%, 20 go, percent 22%, 20 sleep, percent 20 and, percent 20 note, percent 20 wake, percent to you, percent 20 anymore, percent 2, percent 22. Despite Alvarenga's pleading, the young man died in the boat with his arms around Alvarenga's neck. Stricken with grief, Alvarenga held Cordoba close for several days, talking to him and wiping his brow. Then he buried his friend at sea. Only after nearly a week did he gather the strength to give his friend a proper burial. As I slid him into the water, I fainted. Guilt consumed him. Cordoba had been a devout Christian. Why had he died and not me? I had invited him to fish. I blamed myself, Alvarenga. He considered suicide, but his mother's belief that suicide would damn his soul kept him alive. In his darkest hours, he made a promise to himself: survive no matter what. He later vowed to find Cordoba's mother if he made it back. On March 2014, after 438 nights at sea, the exhausted Alvarenga spotted a tiny green island on the horizon, a coral islet in the Marshall Islands. Hope surged through him. Cutting away his remaining sea anchor, he let the current bring him in. When the boat drifted within 10 yards of shore, he dove into the water. He would later laugh that he paddled like a turtle to reach the beach. A wave flung him onto the sand, face down. He gripped a handful of dry sand, like it was a treasure, he told. Weak and emaciated, he crawled beneath coconut palms. Almost nude, he could only stand for a few seconds at a time. He later described himself as skin and bones, every limb aching and wounded. By sheer luck, he stumbled across a small home on the islet's only village. An islander woman, Emi Libokmeto, found him there. She said he was yelling for help and looking dazed. Emi and her husband Russell took the stranger in. Through gestures and drawings, he tried to explain his 7,000-mile ordeal. They could not understand his words, but when he began to laugh, they laughed with him. "I'm not sure why they were laughing," Alvarenga said later, "but I was laughing at being free." Within hours, a Marshall Islands police patrol boat had taken him by motor launch to Majuro for medical aid. He would spend about a week recovering there before flying back home. News of the rescued castaway spread instantly. Videos of him being helped off the patrol boat, gaunt but smiling, went viral. Reporters noted his resemblance to Tom Hanks's Castaway. He later faced the press in a baggy sweatshirt, more robust than anyone imagined. Many called him a modern Robinson Crusoe or Mexican castaway. Doctors were astonished. In Majuro and later in El Salvador, he underwent scans and tests. They found no heart or kidney damage and, remarkably, no severe sunburn or skin lesions from 14 months on. The only major issue was anemia, likely from malnutrition. Salvadoran experts declared Alvarenga's story miraculous but credible.